Saying that Canada is a vast country is a vast understatement. As well as being the second largest country in the world, it is on a whole very sparsely populated, with a total of around 36 million citizens, the same as Tokyo's metropolitan area. As a relatively young country whose area the average person will see less than 1% of in their lifetime, there are many aspects of our culture still under development. One thing that is becoming more and more clear, though, is that Canadian cultural identity is rooted in insular isolated communities, the garrison or fort, that acts as a barrier, a protective shelter from the outside world and the dangers it bears. This principle is reflected throughout many facets of Canadian culture in things such as Canadian politeness, and the fact that 90% of our population lives within 100 miles of the American border. The American notion of explorers trekking through the frontiers into the unknown is not a theme heavily reflected by Canadian literature. It often highlights that we prefer to, or even ought to, stay away from the unknown, taking a more defensive position rather than an offensive one. The garrison extends beyond the physical, however, as Canadian authors and artists have innovated the concept, going from physical garrisons to other types such as mental, emotional, social, linguistic, or cultural. In other words, there are many complex ways to set up a defense. It might be as simple as losing touch with a loved one over the years, or retreating into a social circle that consists primarily of one's own ethnicity or culture. Each of these, however, contributes to an overarching garrison mentality, one that is uniquely Canadian. Contemporary Canadian writers such as Emma Donoghue, Alice Munro, and Ins Choi have found ways to express that although it is true that Canada is a welcoming, tolerant country who embraces multiculturalism to a large extent, especially compared to our neighbors to the south, there are many different subtle ways that Canadians set up defenses against things or people they perceive as potentially dangerous or harmful. Canadian literature is often considered to be a form whose conflict is not obvious, external, or even completely definable. Characters in Alice Munro's short stories, for example, navigate their seemingly mundane worlds in a manner no different from most Canadian citizens. They go to school, find a career, visit their parents at Christmas. At the culmination of what one might expect to be the climax, the character and the reader is usually left by events that don't yield immediate results, but instead produce a certain unbearable ennui. The character's life is changed. They just aren't completely sure how. Listen to how Munro exposes and undercuts the climax in her short story Chance, during the final scene where Juliet finally gets her long-awaited reunion with Eric, the man who would go on to be her husband. He advances on her, and she feels herself ransacked from top to bottom, flooded with relief, assaulted by happiness. How astonishing this is, how close to dismay. In this final scene, Juliet is assaulted by happiness as Eric forcefully breaches her mental, emotional, and sexual garrisons. This and many of Munro's short stories often end in ambiguity, leaving the reader to pick up the pieces, to wonder, why did I just read this? But that feeling is okay. Actually, it's almost as close to a reflection of real life, at least as far as Canadians are concerned, as a piece of literature can get. Munro is navigating her characters' garrisons to see what or who they'll let in, and what they'll keep out. In Juliet's case, she lets in Eric, but at that very moment thinks about the man on the train that she kept out 6 months earlier, who ended up committing suicide because of it. For Munro, then, there is as much meaning in what is said as in what is left unsaid. Inaction can cause just as much trouble or harm as action can. Room by Emma Donoghue depicts the life of Jack, a 5-year-old who has been trapped with his mother in a soundproof garden shed since his birth, and is completely unaware of his predicament because he is shielded from the knowledge of their imprisonment. Ma even goes so far as to tell Jack that the people he sees on television are make-believe, warping his sense of reality to a tragic yet fascinating state. Ma has effectively created a garrison for Jack, an innocence that he eventually loses by the end of the story. Believing that he is the only real boy in the world and all the rest are TV, Jack's frame of reference is based only on an 11 by 11 space, and so he develops a completely unique worldview than Ma, or different as well than the readers of Room. The tension that this creates between Jack and Ma, who experience the same day-to-day activities, is one thing that really keeps the reader interested. The tension that this creates between Jack and Ma, who experience the same day-to-day activities, is one thing that really keeps the reader interested. Jack's happy-go-lucky attitude as he talks to lamp, TV, wardrobe, and even Melody Spoon, and Ma's gone days where she's too depressed to even move, show their completely different dispositions, one innocent and one bleak. They are both trapped, but only Ma feels trapped. Jack can't feel claustrophobic in room because he thinks it's all there is, while Ma endures severe depression, frequent rape, and the knowledge that her life and her son's life may go on and they will never get to experience the outside world. This physical boundary of the shed and Old Nick clearly separate them from the world, and room might then seem like its source of conflict is obvious, but it's not quite that simple. When Ma and Jack finally execute their haphazard plan to escape room, it seems as if all is well, but immediately it becomes clear that outside is almost, if not more, unbearable than room was. Because Jack is subject to many health examinations and is hailed as a hero by the locals, he faces challenges that he never thought existed, and can barely process. The new world of outside is confusing, frightening, and on top of that, Ma attempts suicide. All of these events make Jack wish to retreat back to his comfort zone, room, but that's now out of the question. By the end, however, Jack learns to be more independent, less reliant on Ma, and to learn that trying new things is meaningful despite being scary. This makes the story a good example of a building's roman. Jack and Ma's venture out of their garrison makes apparent a humble truth, though. The only thing they ever needed was right beside them for the whole story. Many people, especially upon their escape, were concerned for Jack, because they assumed he couldn't have had a meaningful childhood if he were trapped in a garden shed. The interviewer even goes so far as to inquire whether Ma considered asking her captor to take Jack away, so he could have had a normal, happy childhood with a loving family. What Jack proves, however, is that his mother's devotion to his well-being and her sacrifices were all that he needed to have a good childhood, and that although outsiders pitied him and thought he was deprived of something, Jack makes multiple observations of negligent parents, and in turn pities children for not having mothers like Ma. Although they were forced into room, it became a garrison where they developed a remarkably close mother-son bond. Similarly, the character Aminata from Lawrence Hill's The Book of Negroes is taken captive against her will during the slave trade, and taken on an incredibly harrowing, perilous journey to an indigo plantation in South Carolina, and also to New York, and even up to Canada. Aminata's intelligence, resilience, and her resolve to tell the story of those who had been wronged is a large part of her garrison. It is perhaps the Garrison mentality that allowed Aminata to carry on. Although literacy is something many people, especially in Canada, take for granted, it means everything to Aminata. She treasures it. Reading felt like a daytime dream in a secret land. Nobody but I knew how to get there, and nobody but I owned that place. So although Aminata's Odyssean journey back home is marked by events far more dramatic and outwardly tragic than that of Monroe characters like Juliet, both of their stories, Ma's and Jack's included, are similar in that the main conflict is a person's search for their own meaning, for personal self-worth, in place of the self-doubt that they and many Canadians are afflicted by. Being a sitcom, Kim's Convenience lacks much of the drama and tragedy of Room and the Book of Negroes, and it lacks the monotony of the Monroe stories. The show's leading characters, Appa and Amma, are first-generation Korean immigrants whose discrepancy with modern Canadian culture many viewers find funny and endearing. Appa's worldview is distinctly Korean, as he spent his formative years there and even had a career as a teacher. Upon coming to Canada, he and Emma set up a convenience store that proudly adorned their family name, which functions as a very unique type of garrison, cultural. Amma and Appa often speak to each other in Korean during the television show, for which they do not provide subtitles. Indeed, the only people who would actually understand what they're saying are those who can speak Korean, making them a part of the cultural garrison of the Kims. This is not to say that the show seeks to exclude other cultures, though. Quite the opposite. Kim's Convenience is by far the most racially inclusive show on CBC's Prime lineup, and even viewers who don't understand Korean can still connect with the characters because many Canadians are either immigrants or children of immigrants. The dynamic provided by the Kim family, where Amma advises her daughter Janet to hook around with a cool Christian Korean boy, is relatable not only to Korean people but to anyone with or anyone who knows of a similar discourse between mother and daughter. In's choice succeeds in Kim's Convenience not only to set up a cultural garrison, but also to make people aware of their own. Shows like it need to be seen on mainstream media more often, given how little coverage people of color and minority groups in general receive. If Canada truly wants to boast a tolerant, multicultural identity that many people give it credit for, Kim's Convenience is a step in the right direction. It is a mark of Canadian literature to be defensive, to be ambiguous, and a bit doubtful. Garrisons of many kinds can be set up by people who might not even know they're doing it, a byproduct of both the country's size and low population density, and the remoteness of the Great White North. Although the unknown can be scary and often dangerous if let past the protective walls of the garrison, meaning is almost always derived through the hardship of finding out. As Jack once said, maybe it's not room if doors open.